Okay, I'm finally ready for the Outriders review on the channel, but before getting started I have to clarify a few different things. One, I've been greatly enjoying my playtime. Understanding that a game is brutally flawed doesn't mean it also can't be fun, and I am having fun, hopefully for quite a few more hours. Two, a game can be more than one thing at the same time, i.e. it can be totally botched from a balancing perspective, while also having excellent loot dynamics, crafting, and item customization. More on that later on. And three, the launch cycle for any game like this will have distinct phases. First is public, widespread excitement. Everything is new and also everything is cool at that time. Next is comfort, as you begin to understand mechanics and farm for specific items / round out build compositions for your character. After that comes apathy, when it becomes clear what the flaws are, whether that be grinding or build structure, etc., etc. And last is frustration, which most people inevitably arrive at when you become aware of exactly why and how the game is typically broken. Everyone watching this review right now will be somewhere in that cycle with Outriders. The good thing is, for many of those people, the positive initial phases might last a pretty lengthy amount of time, but when reviewing a game like this, a game predicated on grinding for loot, which has an intended endgame loop, which ideally should last hundreds, even thousands of hours, it's important to look at all aspects and summarize the experience, including everything from excitement all the way to frustration. A good review can't just ignore the intrinsic and atrocious flaws in this case, but it also can't focus on those flaws exclusively to a point where the positives become overshadowed. With that being said, let's officially get started. Outriders is a third-person looter shooter published by Square Enix. It's not revolutionary, it's not groundbreaking, but it fits well within a genre that has a very large and highly engaged audience who, unfortunately, are all too used to their favorite games launching unfinished, undercooked, and poorly balanced. Examples include Godfall, Anthem, Avengers, Destiny 1 and 2, The Division 1 and 2, etc., etc. Outriders will in fact join this list in a number of categories, but thankfully in one of the most important areas it has found success. That area is loot, item customization, gear progression, and crafting. However, as big as that positive truly is, there is an equally important downside to be seen in the game's skill, stat, and damage mechanics. Overall, Outriders is a brilliant loot farming simulator with atrocious overall balancing. One big area that a lot of people will immediately draw attention to is the game's initial server instability. This has been a focal point, to say the very least, for the first few days of its launch cycle, and while I think it's important to address that kind of issue, it definitely is, I don't believe that it will fit well within this particular review. Effectively, the servers were intermittently down over and over and over again, while the Outriders team would post updates to their, big air quotes there, updates to Twitter, which mostly consisted of them saying, "We know the servers are down, we are trying to fix it, no update other than that." And then the community would just guzzle their e-peen over how transparent that is and how the communication is praiseworthy and a gold standard. Wherever you fall on that doesn't really matter. I, for one, think it was just baffling how a tweet every few hours saying, "Hey, you know it's broken, we know it's broken, no ETA though," and then it would happen again and again and again, results in people sucking your metaphorical Twitter beak. But in the interest of a more gameplay-oriented review, I won't go down the road of speculating on how, why, and what went wrong over and over. However, that's a very interesting topic in and of itself and deserves its own video, so as a result, I'll be linking to another channel, Axial GT, down below, who has a video about that exact topic up right now, which contains far more information than I would be able to include on the topic here, because he has a much larger knowledge pool on the subject to draw from initially. It's a very educational video and also summarizes the launch day issues in a more focused way, which frees me up to base this review on the game itself exclusively, not so much the broken servers. Again, that's linked down below. One thing I do have to add though, they really need to change the music that plays during the opening title screen. You would sit back, just get ready, relax, open up the game, and bam. You get audibly assaulted by way too intense music, and they didn't even put in an exit button. So when the servers were down, which was a ton, you would have to open the task manager and force quit the entire game in order to restart. That's just idiotic. But yeah, enough about the launch. Now I'll focus on the game itself. Outriders is a much more linear experience than other loot-based games on the market right now, for the most part. The game sends players through a labyrinth of main and side missions as they ascend from level 1 to level 30, World Tier 1 to 15, and then Challenge Tier 1 to 15 as well. All three of these progression mechanics are fundamentally separate, but tie back into the loot, which really does create a well-designed infrastructure for future content. The game has 4 different class archetypes, a passive skill tree, 8 active abilities for each class, and then a number of mods, around 5 or 6 typically, for each skill, which opens the door, theoretically, for an insane number of build compositions to be used. On top of that, there are weapon and armor mods, tiers 1, 2, and 3, an item rarity curve, and even individual stats like firepower, anomaly power, which is just ability power, health, short range damage, long range damage, healing received, etc., etc. There's quite a few of them on individual items. Overall, there are many different methods of progression. You can be level 10 on World Tier 1 at your choice, getting level 8 items, or face stronger enemies on World Tier 5. You can select which tier it is if you've unlocked it at any point to get items that are above your current level, but you can equip them anyways up to a specific threshold. That's good design because it gives intrinsic flexibility tied to rewards, and you can get the same experience on lower world tiers, but you won't get the good loot. That makes it incredibly easy to farm your character level up, but once that's done, you need to actually progress through staggered difficulty brackets in order to continue advancing. It really is good design. The effects are overall positive and will be extremely helpful to a large number of players while they go through the initial leveling experience, especially. On top of that, there are the actual drops themselves, and this is where the game begins to truly shine. Loot obviously drops at various different rarity levels, but once you have some gear that you do like, the options really open up. You can boost the stat levels on that gear through shards obtained from dismantling the gear that you don't want. You can boost the level on that gear with titanium farmed from bosses or gained from dismantling other high-tiered items. You can switch the perks on that item and choose from dozens of available options, which will be selected from your persistent perk library, which again gets rounded out by dismantling items you don't want. And in the case of weapons, you can even modify the base archetype of the gun. This might actually sound like gibberish to someone who has not played the game, so let me simplify it. Basically, when you get an item that is even close to what you want, you can make it what you truly want and improve it, and then bring it with you beyond that level without being forced to get exceedingly lucky over and over and over again. Once you have dismantled tons of items, you will have tons of perks, and you can slot them into new items at any point in the future. And since almost all of the crafting materials are gained from dismantling unwanted gear, instead of feeling a sense of honestly frustration when you can't find the exact item that you want, which occurs in all too many games, you will feel a sense of anticipation almost always, because so many items can be manipulated in the crafting interface, and even if they can't be, they give a multitude of essential components when dismantled to strengthen the things that you actually do like in the future. This game comes just about as close as I have ever seen to eliminating the sense of waste and useless gear as drops that so many other games apparently struggle with, and seriously, they do struggle with it rather intensely. It's exceptional, and it needs to be copied in the future by other titles. However, as good as the loot really is, and it is, in fact, incredible, the balancing weighs it down. Here's where I will have some incredibly harsh things to say. So anyone who still has those rose-tinted glasses on, which is some of you, I know it is, or has not yet gone through to challenge tier 15 or even close and understood the fundamentals of successful endgame mission farming, brace yourself. 4 classes, 8 abilities for each class, and 3 different passive skill trees for each class as well. One would expect, knowing this, that it would create diversity. One would expect that different playstyles would be viable, and one would expect that those different classes, skills, and passive trees would be somewhat different in and of themselves. That expectation is wrong. The classes seem different on a surface level. The abilities certainly do have differences if you compare them individually, but among those abilities are 3 comparable effects called Twisted Rounds for the Trickster, Blighted Rounds for the Technomancer, and Volcanic Rounds for the Pyromancer. These abilities have slightly different secondary effects, but the premise is the same. Modify the bullets in your current magazine, make them deal more damage, and then through a number of different gear mods, weapon mods, or skill mods, the choice is yours, you can make that bonus infinite as long as you land killing blows on enemies. That is basically the only endgame viable build right now in the entire game. I could be wrong, okay, I want to be wrong. It might be possible for someone to craft an off-meta build that is able to complete the high-tier challenge content, but it gets worse. Because the challenge tier missions, which compose the lion's share of actual endgame content, are all exclusively predicated on speed. And speed is a direct function of damage in this case. So if you aren't running an incredibly high damage-oriented build, you can't get through the drop pod missions, right? And you can't get the good rewards. That's effectively it. I hope everyone can kind of see where this is going. 3 out of the 4 classes have relatively similar your bullets are now stronger type abilities, and the 4th class doesn't. In the demo, it actually looked like this fourth class, the Devastator, would be incredibly strong, but seeing the full scope of Endgame, that couldn't be further from the truth. Basically, Devastator just tickles enemies, while Trickster, Pyromancer, and Technomancer all use a nearly identical build, regardless of what you do, to have infinite gun magazines, and then sprint through the timed endgame missions. Remember that passive tree? Yeah, pretty much nothing except the top damage-oriented pathway is viable. And when you compare the passive trees, most of the nodes are pretty much the exact same thing across all four classes. Now, obviously, okay, keep this in mind before anyone types out a comment. Obviously, you can make something other than that type of build, like a high anomaly power, ability-centered character that uses three things other than the modified bullets, right? It's possible, but since pretty much all of the end game content is timed missions, and anomaly power simply cannot ever stack up against bullet damage with blighted, volcanic, or twisted rounds, you effectively can't do endgame. The ultimate reality is that a game with incredible loot and seemingly massive potential for different builds really only has 3 builds that are viable, and anything else that works is basically a slight variation on that concept. It really is. If you found something else, please tell me, but that's really what it's looking like. You can't do the end game without using one of these 3 builds. You can't get the good gear without conforming to this incredibly narrow metagame dynamic, unless you just want to be carried every single mission while you CC enemies and that's your only role. But even then, you literally can't do the end game by yourself, so you would always have to be carried. There is content that you can do outside of this typical endgame loop, such as hunts or bounties. Notably, the hunts give a guaranteed legendary item every time you turn them all in and then reset, as well as the ability to replay any side mission or quest on any world tier, up to 15, at any time to farm for gear, which really is an excellent system for expanding the amount of rewarding content available to players so they aren't stuck farming one particular mission over and over if they don't want to. But when you see past the first few stages of excitement, which happened pretty quick for me, even though I didn't think it would, and understand just how incredibly narrow the balancing really is at this point in time, it's hard to ignore. Other areas to discuss include graphics, which are perfectly fine in my eyes, not too bad, but nothing revolutionary. Stability, which was bad for a few days, but largely seems to have improved, though I did get locked up so hard a couple of times I had to restart my entire computer because the screen froze and nothing would come up in other windows. And then story, but I don't play this type of game for the story. The campaign had a passable narrative as far as I'm concerned, but what it really came down to was the loot. I could have had no story at all and I'd still play if there was a drive to find more gear and get stronger, and then use that gear to kill harder enemies and get even more gear. Like, if that loop fundamentally exists and is good, I'll play the game no matter what. Which this game does have, it absolutely does, and still has, but the balancing is so horrifyingly bad and so narrow, I don't know how much longer that will last. For anyone who has a drive to feel unique, this game has a pretty severe struggle with that. Overall, it has an excellent foundation in its loot and crafting systems. It's not immune to bugs and glitches like invisible walls here and there, the HUD disappearing for some players, which is actually pretty bad and I don't know how to fix it. I think there's a Reddit thread on that and I believe that they're putting out fixes for that kind of stuff. Or an infinite bleed damage stacking glitch that I found one time, though I couldn't find a way to replicate that one. And it's far from a revolutionary product to redefine the genre, but it gets the loot right, and that really is truly worth praising. If they fix the balancing, which is a big if, which would require a near complete overhaul of the passive trees and a lot of the abilities, as well as the complete stat scaling on tons of different gear perks and class abilities. Like, basically, they might have to redo the entire thing to get the balancing right. Then it has a future. The loot is really good, but the balancing is so botched, it's really baffling. But anyone looking to buy this game should probably just get it on Game Pass. That's about the level of value that we're looking at here. It's not bad, and it gets a lot of things right. But for every good thing, for every pro, if you will, there is something equal, if not worse, in the con category. I'm currently having fun, but it's got serious issues. One final thing, though, and this really does have to be brought up, it's hard to make it a focus of the review because it isn't technically something that relates to the mechanical design or gameplay, but Outriders is always online. And that's a huge, brutal, and obnoxious screw-up for everyone involved. Always online in a game that is entirely, even preferably with how bad the matchmaking has been these past few days, playable solo, is the wrong move, period. The always online choice means that if you have internet issues, no game. If they have server issues, and they have tons of them, no game. And on top of that, which is 100% criticism worthy, it has kernel level anti-cheat, which is not a good thing. I won't go down that rabbit hole right now, but It's just another thing on the pile. Again, I have to separate these topics when I'm discussing how good the loot is or is the gameplay fun, but they are problems that exist and need to be said. There are aspects of the game itself that are good, even great. I'll go that far. But a lot of the surrounding infrastructure and choices are not good at all. Even as I scripted and then recorded this, and especially as I did the voice, I wanted to get back online to get some more footage for the background. I couldn't. There first were connectivity issues and crashes, which I believe happened server side. Then there were problems with my own internet stability. Bottom line, always online is a cannonball to the foot of this game, and that combined with everything else make it impossible to recommend a full priced purchase. Get it on Game Pass, or wait at least till it's heavily discounted. No other way to say it. That's it. If you want support, there are links down below, such as the video about server issues and the launch window disaster by Axial GT. Go subscribe to him. He actually built my computer, which makes it possible for me to play games like this. There's also Odyssey, where my entire content library is available on an alternative platform. Also Locals to support for $5 a month. Merch, social media, etc., etc. But I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.